Why China is losing the microchip war. Can you imagine a machine that makes the most advanced computer chips in the world? Well, there's only one company that makes it, ASML. After a key engineer, Zhongxing Yu, left ASML, he started two companies in the US and China. The US and ASML accused him of recruiting engineers and stealing crucial information backed by the Chinese government. This is just a small part of China's big effort to dominate the semiconductor industry, leading to a tense struggle with the United States. It's not just about market share or tariffs, it's a security showdown. How did this Cold War over computer chips begin? In the 1950s, engineers in the U.S. created the first semiconductor chip using a piece of silicon with 4 transistors. These chips got more powerful as they added more transistors, with a prediction in 1965 by Intel's founder, Gordon Moore, that computing power would double each year. The U.S., with its first chip-making companies, mainly served the U.S. government. Initially, these chips were used in NASA spacecraft guidance computers and missile systems. The government of the U.S. assumed that being in close contact with every chip firm that is producing better chips every year would ensure that they always get access to the most accurate one. The U.S. powers have realized long ago that computers are essential in determining the cyber power of a nation and its dominance on the global platform. Think about the applications of computers used in decoding codes during World War II or tracking Soviet submarines in the Cold War. First, these semiconductor corporations dedicated themselves to whole supply chain management. They designed the chips, produced them, and put them in packages that were ready to install with the product in the United States. However, they soon learned that civilians were ready to pay much more money for semiconductors used in such devices as business computers than for those made only for military purposes. They only had to manufacture many of these units at a significantly reduced cost. Many chip firms relocated their production and assembly operations to facilities in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong, where labor was less expensive, with the U.S. government encouraging them. All of these nations were U.S. friends or partners, and this was a method to boost their economies and strengthen connections. At the same time, it prohibited these chip makers from sharing technology with their competitors, the Soviet Union and China. It was a method to keep them years behind the United States as chip technology evolved. Because of Moore's law, modern processors outperform older versions. If you're 5 or 10 years behind, you're truly fairly far behind the curve. However, it wasn't long before these allied countries started investing in their own semiconductor businesses. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Toshiba in Japan and Samsung in South Korea began creating and producing semiconductors that competed with the Americans. In the 1990s, a Taiwanese manufacturer, TSMC, became so adept at chip production that many corporations in the United States abandoned it. It meant that U.S. businesses were no longer the only ones capable of producing the most sophisticated semiconductors. Every country's chip sector became increasingly reliant on other countries for the ingredients, software, and equipment required to manufacture more complicated semiconductors. However, while the United States and its allies were pushing the boundaries of semiconductor technology, China lagged behind. In addition to the U.S. restricting access to chips during the Cold War, the tyrant Mao Zedong drove many of China's top scientists and engineers out of the nation in the 1960s and 1970s. However, throughout the next few decades, successive Chinese leaders worked to catch up. By the 1990s, the Cold War had ended, the U.S. had grown more friendly with China, and the majority of its export prohibitions had been relaxed. As a result, several semiconductor makers chose to relocate their assembly operations to China. By the 2000s, China had controlled this end of the supply chain. However, when China imported more chips to fuel its assembly sector, it found itself in a difficult situation. The Chinese government investigated the technology supply chain and discovered that the whole Chinese tech ecosystem was built on imported silicon from China's geopolitical rivals, the United States, Japan, and Taiwan. And rightly, China's leaders felt that this was a risk they did not want to accept any longer. So the Chinese government invested heavily in its own chip design and manufacturing companies, which increasingly collaborated with non-Chinese corporations in the goal of developing a chip supply chain that was totally Chinese. China will soon be able to design, produce, and assemble some earlier generations of chips almost entirely on its own, but it was still years away from producing the most advanced processors. This is one of those chips. It has around 114 billion transistors on it. Remember, in the 1960s, chips had 4. Computing capabilities in the future, like those in the past, will be employed for military purposes. The difficulty is that just a few businesses throughout the world manufacture them, and none are in China. To begin, just 3 American businesses create the software required to build sophisticated semiconductors. Then, to transform those ideas into actual chips, a machine that is only manufactured by one company, ASML. However, this machine requires equipment that is solely manufactured in the United States. Finally, only Taiwanese and South Korean businesses can bring it all together and produce the most powerful CPU chips. These businesses are bottlenecks in the supply chain, and China relied entirely on them for sophisticated semiconductors. In 2019, authorities in the United States attempted to arrest Zhong Chengyu, but were unable to locate him, until he surfaced later in China as the CEO of his firm, which successfully produced software similar to ASML's. His business was thriving thanks to Chinese government assistance. His tale was only one of many cases of intellectual property theft in the semiconductor business. The Chinese government has been, at the very least, passively sympathetic and, in some cases, actively encouraging of intellectual property theft because it recognizes that its enterprises are in a position of relative vulnerability. To gradually reduce its dependency on this foreign supply chain, China identified and copied choke spots such as ASML, but the idea flopped. And this has infuriated the U.S. administration and other nations, prompting them to view China's subsidies as a security concern rather than an economic one. In 2018, the Trump government prohibited U.S. firms from providing components to ZTE, a Chinese technology company. Then in 2019, it prohibited U.S. corporations from doing business with China's largest technology giant, Huawei, and its affiliates. These prohibitions almost bankrupted ZTE and caused a major blow to Huawei. In 2022, the next president, Joe Biden, expanded his focus on China's semiconductor sector. First, it prohibited all U.S. businesses from exporting sophisticated chips to China, as well as Chinese design firms from utilizing U.S.-made design software and production equipment. Additionally, it prohibited worldwide firms that leverage U.S. semiconductor technology from supplying sophisticated chips to China. The United States was using these choke spots to halt China's semiconductor sector in its tracks. These export limitations marked a significant move away from the belief that trade and tax exchanges with China were ultimately a net positive sum to a far more zero-sum perspective of technology competitiveness. Next, the United States approved legislation to invest billions of dollars in its own chip manufacturing businesses and reached an agreement with Taiwan's largest manufacturer, TSMC, to develop production operations in the United States, all to allow the U.S. to continue racing ahead. When it comes to semiconductors, China and the United States see the political stakes similarly. That is why the U.S. administration has prioritized defending its lead. However, this has heightened tensions in another confrontation between the two countries. Since 1949, China has seen Taiwan as a separatist province and has promised to reconnect with it, even threatening invasion. The United States has sworn to safeguard Taiwan. However, Taiwan also owns the most crucial choke point in the semiconductor supply chain. Taiwanese businesses produce 63% of all chips and around 92% of sophisticated chips. Taiwan has constructed some protection for itself by having firms that are critical to both the U.S. and Chinese semiconductor sectors. However, U.S. export limits prompted Taiwanese businesses to choose between defying the U.S. and continuing to sell to China or complying and cutting off China's supply of certain chips. So far, they've indicated that they'll cut off China. However, as China and the United States compete over chips, more and more options like these will be forced on countries and businesses throughout the world, asking people to select sides in what appears to be a new Cold War.